All right. So I'd love to welcome and introduce Sophia. And Sophia, I'm going to publicly ask you to first tell me how to pronounce your last name, because I haven't gotten a chance to do this before.
That is A-okay. It's the coolest name you've ever heard, Sophia
Okay.
Koukoulas.
I love that. Sophia Koukoulas, beautiful, thank you. Sophia is the Communication and Stakeholder Relations Manager at First Work, and she's been there since June 2020, so just at the start of the pandemic. Fun times. And previously, she has worked for the Ontario Minister of Finance as Issues Manager and Legislative Assistant, following years of political work at the municipal, state, provincial, and federal levels in both US and Canada. Most recently, Sophia was a senior consultant at a government relations firm focused on strategic communication and Ontario government mandates. Earlier on in her career, though, Sophia worked with homeless and at-risk youth in downtown Toronto. So both a lot of high-level consulting, but also frontline experience. So we're thrilled to have you, Sophia, and thank you for agreeing to do this presentation today. I'll say a little bit about First Work, but Sophia will add more information during the presentation and what is the First Work's relationship to the EO transformation. But just for your information, First Work is a membership organization of youth programming and employment services, business leadership, academia, and government, whose mandate and goal is to advance solutions for youth employment. This is not the complete membership, but I've just put a little map, part of the map here for you to get a sense of the number of members and the geographic distribution of members. Many of you who are here today, your organizations are members of First Work. And so without further ado, I'm going to give the control and to Sophia. I think I just quickly need to make you a oops, here we go, a host or a co-host. You should be able to now share your presentation. This is what, oh, sorry, my bad.
Nope,
bad.
I got it.
There is another quick question, a quick slide. So before we start, as people registered, there have been lots of questions that came in with the registration. So here's a quick overview of everything that's been asked as folks registered for today's presentation. So questions around timelines and SSM. You know, when will Toronto be transformed? When will it officially begin? When will we find out who the SSM is? Will there be more than one? Who will it be, etc.? So lots of questions around that, but also questions around the transition itself. So what prep do we need to do in advance? What are some of the best practices in relation to the transition? What are the benefits of the new model, as well as what are some areas of concern to look out for? And how do you prepare staff for the transition? And also questions around impact. How will this impact my organization, general public, clients, specifically youth or specifically newcomers, as well as how will it impact co-delivery of programming for certain groups like bridging programs for newcomers? And also a question around outcomes. A very kind of nitty-gritty question around, you know, what will count as an employment outcome. So you can see that example here. So again, even if your questions are here, feel free to still put them in the chat as we go through the presentation. And then we will take the questions from the chat at the end of Sophia's presentation for the Q&A portion. So I'm going to stop sharing, and Sophia, you can take it away.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Okay, so I'm really hoping that I have this set up properly, so I'm not clicking out of my PDF that I have here, but just forgive me if that happens. I will bring it back to a full screen if that takes place.
Okay.
So thank you, Serna, for the introduction. Truly appreciate it. And I'm happy that we remembered that question slide. I was able to review some of those questions in advance, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to tackle some of them as we go through the presentation. Some of them are naturally covered by the presentation, but certainly we can have discussion about those questions once we've managed to get through all of this information. So as Serna mentioned, I have experience from the front lines, but I am not a front lines practitioner. And I really did join the space or the sector just in pandemic. And so there will definitely be aspects of the system that you are more familiar with as day in, day out practitioners. But my hope is that through the work that First Work has done to monitor this transformation, that I'll be able to share with you the key insights that will help you in your practice or help you prepare for what is to come. So, well, why don't we just move right on into my agenda? So I'm going to start off with a very high level overview of the transformation. And I do mean very high level at the get-go. We're going to talk about the government's goals and kind of the phases of where we're at in transformation. I am going to spend a little bit more time on those phases just so that we can better understand where Toronto sits in all of this. Before I talk very quickly about First Works monitoring process, just to give some validity to why it is we're speaking to you today. We'll then dig into the nitty-gritty of this performance-based employment services model. So this new transformed model of integrated employment service delivery before getting into some sector insights and recommendations, systemic considerations, and then finally for questions. As I mentioned, this is a very comprehensive topic. So I am going to do my best to lay this out in a way that is digestible to everyone. Please do, though, submit your questions in the chat. I will be keeping an eye just in case there are core issues with understanding. I got my tea here. I will try not to run out of breath on you all. So let us dig in. Ontario's employment services are transforming. The government has laid out that their goals with this transformation are to ensure that job seekers in the province have one avenue for employment supports. So that no matter their circumstances, no matter their disabilities, that they're able to get the supports that they need through one avenue. Through that, the government has three kind of sub-goals within this. So there is a need for system efficiency. So there is a reduction in the duplications that there might be in the system, considering that there are two ministries at play here. So under MLTSD, we have OW and ODSP employment supports. Under MLITSD, we have EO. So with that system efficiency, we'll bring in all the employment supports under the EO umbrella. Their secondary goal is to have a locally informed system. So one that is not top down from Queen's Park, but one that is born from the community that it resides in. This is where we see the introduction of new catchment areas for service delivery and our new actors, the service system managers, or SSMs. I'm going to say SSMs a lot, so service system managers. Finally, the goal for government is that this new system be results driven. And so with that comes streamlining of services and evaluation tools. So that way there is results not just for the job seeker, the employer, and the community at large. Alrighty, very high level. We're going to dig in more to this. In terms of how this transformation is being rolled out, we are seeing a multi-phased process. Back in 2021, we saw the prototype catchment areas being Peel, Hamilton, Niagara, and I have a typo, Muskoka, Kawartha. They initiated the transition to the new model on January 1st of 2021. And they're referred to as the prototype catchments. Our phase 2 folks were announced in April 2022 initially, although some folks who pay better attention to ministry memos might know that Kingston Pembroke, a region in the phase 1 catchments, had their announcement delayed until September. However, they're being afforded the same timeline, the same time frame, that their cohorts have. However, it's 6 months delayed. We were supposed to hear about the phase 2 catchments by the end of 2022. We have not had a public announcement yet of what SSMs have been selected for these phase 2 catchments. However, there is indication that there's a stronger mix of municipalities in play with these phase 2 catchments, which is a positive. It's a little bit in the weeds. We'll talk about that a bit more in sector considerations. Finally, this brings us to our phase 3 catchments, which is where Toronto sits. And I am going to spend just a bit more time on here so we can understand where we're at in this process. So you may recall, or you may have been a part of some of the market sounding sessions that took place this fall. And those market sounding sessions are actually the first step in the SSM selection process. So those market sounding sessions are informing the development of the request for qualification. That RFQ has not been released publicly yet, although we anticipate it to be released soon. Oh, thank you so much for closed captioning. So we anticipate it to be released soon. However, I just want to note that that is just another step in the process. Following the RFQ, there will be a call for proposals for qualified applicants. And then there will be the selection of the service system manager. So we are in RFQ development process right now. In theory, that will be released soon, and then we'll have this process continue. That is why we have 2023, 2024 for this. We anticipate that transition to the new integrated service model will take place in 2024. Exactly when is to be seen. However, all indication from the ministry is that that this transformation is on track. And that actually kind of segues me a bit nicely to talk about FirstWorks research and monitoring process. So we have formally been monitoring the changes on the ground, thanks to the strength of our network. I only saw one person in here, so I'll just shout out Tracy. But the reason we're able to speak about this topic is because we are a network of over 100 agencies that convene on a monthly basis to discuss the issues that we're facing and develop best practices to solve for these issues. Sorry, I'm saying that word a lot. So we've been formally monitoring since December 2020 with the initiation of our SSM monitoring committee. That committee has convened regularly to share insights on the ground. They have also participated in some of our conferences for those real on the ground perspectives. We as First Work have interviewed nearly all of the SSMs, specifically those in the prototype regions for certain, in addition to some of the new service system managers that have been selected. And we have discussed our findings and our recommendations with both the Ministry of Labor and the Ministry of Community and Social Services. You might have thought I lost my segue. I'll pick it back up here. As I mentioned, the government has almost seamlessly maintained their timeline of this transformation planning. And certainly it was a bit of a surprise to us that that timeline would be maintained, particularly from the perspective that prototype catchments moved into the transition on January 1st, 2021, still very much in the acuity of pandemic. And so when it was announced in June of that year that transformation would be moving forward as intended, First Work decided to release an early insights report. We felt that it was critical that we urgently get out a document that outlined some of the concerns, not just held by practitioners, but also held by service system managers throughout this process. We leveraged that report into our first State of the Sector report that was released last January, A Year in Transition, Ontario's Employment Services Transformation. We are set to release another report within the month, and we do look forward to sharing that widely. We will be submitting and discussing that report with government, and we are looking forward to continuing to leverage that report, not only with the Ministry of Labor, but again, with the Ministry of Community and Social Services, as well as some other ministries as it aligns. That is First Work and most of the activities that we have undertaken to keep an eye on this process. So let's dig into the nitty-gritty. Okay. Because this is such a comprehensive topic, I find it easiest to think of transformation in 3 major buckets, so 3 major changes. We've already spoken to these loosely when we spoke about the government goals, and you'll see how they align. So our first major change that we see with this transformation is that integration of OW and ODSP employment supports into the EO umbrella. That achieves the one pathway for anyone, no matter their ability. And of course, that also includes youth. Our second major change is that introduction of new service delivery catchments and those new actors, SSMs. With this change, there is also a shift for the ministry that they become more of a system steward as opposed to a manager. And that's important from the perspective that the ministry will continue to dictate some programming from the center, but largely they are reliant on their service system managers and their local expertise to develop new programming and ensure that that programming meets the needs of their community. So specifically within this, we are losing youth job connection. So with a more efficient system, there is a need to reduce overall programming And we see that with Youth Job Connection. I am going to come back to talk about youth a bit more poignantly as we move forward. Before I do that, we'll talk about the third change, which is performance-based incentives. So previously, funding was based on client volumes with some degree for performance. In the new model, we have, excuse me, the new model, we now have 20% of operating funding that will be designated for performance-based incentives. And those incentives are designed to promote retention and accountability through streaming. Let's dig into that. Oops. Slow scroll here. Okay. So as you can see here, in the new model, the funding system breaks down that 20% is reserved for performance-based funding. There's further breakdown here for 12% of budgets to be allocated for direct financial supports for clients. So flow through dollars, we're talking work boots, blazers, whatever it be. Then 68% remains whole for operational funding. Within this performance-based funding scheme, there is a sliding scale, if you will, to progressively incentivize positive outcomes, for higher risk clients, so that those that need more help get the help that they require, and the system isn't inadvertently gearing success for those who are maybe more low touch clients. Trapped. It's scrolling. To determine who is furthest from employment, to ensure that you're servicing those clients the most, there is the introduction of the Common Assessment Tool. And I realized I forgot to stop and pause for questions. And I wonder if I should at this time, or just like encourage folks to pop stuff into the chat, because I did mean to do that 2 slides back. So my apologies.
There have been no questions in the chat yet. So if anybody does have a question, maybe just raise your hand. We'll pause for 10 seconds and see if anybody does that. Otherwise, we can keep going.
Corinne.
Sorry, thank you, Sophia and Sarno. Did I hear correctly that YJC will be cut?
Yes. In the new model, YJC will cease to exist.
Wow. Okay, thank you.
I know we don't put it up on a slide in a big, bold axe kind of way, but yes, YJC will no longer be offered in the fully transformed integrated employment services model, so the new model. Youth, though, are designated as a priority population. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. But I have it as a pin to come back to if I forget to mention it as we go along. So as I mentioned, performance-based funding, 20% of this, or 20% of operating budgets dedicated towards this. And this is to ensure from a government perspective that those who need the most supports are getting the most supports. How does government know who needs the most supports? That's where the Common Assessment Tool comes in. For those of you who don't know what the Common Assessment Tool is, I do want to say out loud that FirstWork has a copy of it. So if anybody wants a version or would like to have a look at that, that we have that available and happy to share. The Common Assessment Tool is up to 150 questions that get fairly in detail and in the weeds to ultimately spit out a stream of service. Now, the Common Assessment Tool, the dual intention with the Common Assessment Tool is to also ensure that a client only has to tell their story once. This is so that no matter the referrals that happen, that the stream and the information that is associated with that stream will be sufficient so that a client doesn't have to continue to divulge a story. However, and for those of you who may have utilized the CAT or in practice, the questions are incredibly, to quote participants, intrusive at times. And so a question like, well, have you ever experienced food insecurity or something to that effect? And it's particularly concerning for populations that we know are less likely to be overt in the barriers they may face. And so it's difficult, especially at a first introduction, to accurately kind of assess a person's circumstances. So the Common Assessment Tool is supposed to alleviate those burdens while also, copy of the CAT. Yes, happy to share a copy of the CAT with everyone. And sorry, I'm digging in on the robustness of the Common Assessment Tool, only because though you can serve a client as you see fit without a stream outcome, you can't enter the client into service without completing the Common Assessment Tool. And that can be difficult if you're trying to build a relationship with a client that you're working with. So it doesn't mean that you can't work around it, but to enter a client into service formally or on the system, they need to have a Common Assessment Tool stream outcome to be submitted with that. So it can put a bit of a hiccup in place. Okay, so that's a Common Assessment Tool. We can chat about that a little bit further on if we need to, but I do want to talk about these streams that we have in front of us. So again, outcome of the Common Assessment Tool will spit out a stream. Stream A here indicates closest to employment, whereas stream C is at highest risk of long-term unemployment. B's are right in the middle. And you can see here that there is increased funding levels associated as that client is further from employment. So that's so that we're not just servicing the low touch clients that can get our numbers up and get our incentives in very quickly. And there's actually dedication to those who need more supports. Quick pause here to talk about youth. This Common Assessment Tool, it's an algorithm. And so that's why I say up to 150 questions, because it does use smart logic in that questionnaire to bring folks, to the different types of questions that might need to be answered there. And because it's an algorithm, it's a work in progress. And so the ministry has indicated that it is through the adoption of the Common Assessment Tool that the streaming will become more accurate. Sorry. The reason why I brought up the accuracy is because when this stream is inputted into the system, it is essentially set in stone. The individual service system manager is able to facilitate a change in what that stream might be. But to be clear, there isn't a direct pathway for this. And there isn't an opportunity for the individual practitioner to dictate what that stream should be. That can definitely be problematic for some who might have a client that they perceive as very near homelessness, but is answering questions that bring them to an A outcome. That becomes difficult. However, and we'll dig into this a bit more, service system managers have been quite helpful in establishing workarounds or establishing fixes where they need to be. Okay, spent a little bit too much time on this. I'm just going to check the chat quickly. Okay. Oops.
There's lots of interest in the common assessment tool. Lots of folks would like to have it, and lots of questions around it. So I think we can keep them for the Q&A period, and make sure we get the other parts covered too. Does that work?
Perfect. Yeah, that would be great, because we'll cover off some of it during the next few slides, and I am keeping a closer eye on the time now. Okay. So those are the core components of what we're seeing with transformation. And you're probably thinking, why haven't you talked more about service system managers? I want to address that. So of the 3 prototype catchments that we saw that are fully in the new model, and our phase 2 catchments, which brings us to 7. Those 7 different catchments have, I think, 4 different SSMs in total, 5 in total. Regardless, they all bring their own unique approach to service delivery and to management. So I saw a question briefly, I think, in the chat that asked about systems, data management systems. And that is probably not a question that I can answer directly, because it is up to the individual SSM to determine if they want to introduce a new data management system. That data management system would have to speak with and connect with CAMS, but it's under the purview of that selected service system manager. The reason I bring it up is because we have had one of the repeat SSMs introduce their own case management platform. And it does mean that, like any kinks in a new system, you need to ensure that you have your own tracking methods happening and taking place in the background, which could mean, instead of, you might already have that because CAMS is CAMS. So it would mean maintaining your internal tracking system, CAMS, and the new system. But we don't know who the SSM is going to be. So, and we've only seen one introduce a new case management system. So anyway, I just wanted to add that little bit. Okay. So through transformation, we have gleaned a few major themes. I'm going to speak to them on the following slides here, but just as a quick overview, one of the real positives that we've seen through this is an increase in collaboration, like as a system partner between the SSM and the ESP themselves. And this is enabling a sense of localism that is really appreciated in the system. At the same time, though, that sense of localism needs to be translated outwards to all community partners. So that means OW partners, that means employers who might be reliant on some of the incentives through some programming. YJCS, for example, that falls within the ministry purview that needs to be enhanced. I also want to spend some time to talk about the change in client profile that we're seeing in the shift, because that for some, and really from an organizational viewpoint, can be a little bit difficult. We'll talk about some growing pains with the common assessment tool. And lastly, I want to say this because we won't spend too much time on it, but the fact that this is all taking place in the backdrop of pandemic and economic disruption is not lost on any of us monitoring this process or living through this process. However, it is a point that we have to reiterate to our government partners. And also when we look at items like evaluation, that we'll have to be honest in terms of what we're seeing and what we think we're seeing. Okay, so as I mentioned, because we have, instead of a Queen's Park down-driven system, that this new model really does enhance a sense of localism. This means that these service system managers are actually outreaching and engaging with not only agencies and practitioners, but the wraparound supports that they help to facilitate. They're also, by and large, private corporations that are coming into the mix. They are bringing a very business savvy kind of attitude towards the agencies that they work with. So one of my favorite quotes is not here, is something to the effect of, you know, you'll write them at any hour of the day and they'll get back to you within a half an hour. And certainly I have heard, again, not a frontline practitioner myself, have heard that the ministry can sometimes keep you holding your breath. And so certainly that is very appreciated. And with that, there's a sense that it's a partnership. They're not talking at you, they're talking with you, which again, varies by SSM and varies by catchment. But throughout all of this, and as I hinted at with the common assessment tool, the SSMs are committed to advocating for their agencies. So when they encounter, when we as practitioners encounter challenges, they know that they have to solve those challenges, and how they go about solving them, because their boss is also government, can be more in the dark. However, they are very committed to the success of their communities and their catchments. So the communication is certainly exceptionally positive. As I hinted at, though, employers certainly are a stakeholder that could be better informed throughout this process. Definitely, our social assistance partners need to be better informed of this process. Now, with the introduction of an EST secretariat being Gloria Lee, whose mandate is to ensure seamless collaboration between MLITSD and MCCSS, between both ministries, there's continued room and need for enhancement there. I don't want anyone to remember this as like the key aspect of transformation, but when our prototype catchments transitioned, there was a real lack of communication with OW partners that did impede referrals being sent over and referrals being really effectively like transitioned over. And that seems to have lessened by and large. I think just by nature of more communication being out there. But certainly it wasn't a fun process through that. And so we as First Work are continuing to work with our partners at Odin, for example, to help ease some of this process. We spoke about employers. That was specifically important in regards to Youth Job Connections Summer, as those employers were unaware that their incentives would not be available. And inter-ministry communication, absolutely. Moving forward, sorry, I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Okay. Change in client profile. This has been one of the, I think, biggest kind of mindset shifts that needs to take place with transformation. So not only is there a higher mix of folks with more complex barriers in the system, but also I just realized I missed an item when we were talking about performance-based incentives. Drat. I am so sorry. Really quickly. With performance-based incentives, there is a change in what a positive outcome is. Positive outcomes are defined by retained employment. And retained employment specifically at the 1, 3, 6, 9, and 12-month markers. I think everybody knew that based on some of the questions that I had. However, happy to dig more into that in a bit. It jumped to my mind on this slide because with that retained employment outcome, there needs to be 20 hours of work per week. And we know that for folks with a disability, particularly, but for many other folks that are re-entering the workforce or regardless, 20 hours is too much. And so with that, First Work is advocating for flexibility along that rule. But I am so sorry, I forgot to mention that. But with a change in client profile, especially as we think of youth, we know that there are more interventions required typically to get them to employment ready, and then even more so to retention ready. And because we have milestone indicators at 1, 3, 6, 9, 12, caseloads are getting more voluminous by nature. Clients cannot be exited from the system until they have achieved those successful outcomes. And so there can be a pause for training or education, but clients aren't being closed in the same way. And so in addition to a change of who that client is, there's a much larger volume of caseloads to be working with. This starts discussion on some of the trainings that we see as very necessary for accommodating these changes. Applying a long-term case management lens is really key within that, as well as motivational interviewing. And specifically trauma-informed motivational interviewing is really what we're recommending to prepare staff to not only better serve clients with multiple complex barriers, but to also better stream clients via the common assessment tool by asking questions in a way that is trauma and motivational interviewing informed so that you can get the correct details out of folks, even though those questions are not necessary, require more trust building typically to be answered. Alrighty, sorry, just very aware of time. Finally, within streamlined service provision, there are all these issues that I've already addressed. Oh my gosh. Okay. So the common assessment tool is completed very early in the process, right? Not allowing for that time for relationship building. And as I mentioned, it is fairly set in stone. Once the stream is entered into the system, it requires advocating to the SSM for that to be changed. Even if that client comes in and tells you, yes, I've lost my housing, I am homeless, advocacy required. The loss of youth job connection, again, with the streamlining of services, I think showcases more than anything the misunderstanding the government has for why youth require unique supports. And this kind of brings us to a broader, I think, newcomer discussion as well. So one of the initial concerns that we had with Common Assessment Tool was that youth were being streamed as A clients, so low touch clients. And our practitioners know that they shouldn't be streaming as A, and flagged, and there were so many unsuitable streams for youth as A clients that the ministry has actually gone back to the algorithm and made some adjustments to indicate that they should be streaming more as a C. That was announced in November, I think, or October. It would have been at our Futures conference that was expressed. And we're unsure of how that's translating on the ground at this moment in time, but it certainly is a positive step that the government is willing to make these changes as very defined issues are identified. So that is comforting from that perspective. The other item that I wanted to talk about, just in regards to the loss of youth job connection, is that with streamlined services and that sense of localism, that dependent upon the SSM, they can designate, a pot of funding for a priority population group. And because youth are identified as one of those priority population groups, we did see some agencies just bring back YJC in that catchment. It is dependent upon the SSM saying, yes, we'll create this pot of funding. And and then that agency having the necessary items needed to deliver that kind of program. So we are encouraged by that kind of flexibility that individual SSMs are offering up, but there are still some kind of youth-focused issues that we foresee within streaming and the Common Assessment Tool writ large. I know I keep saying finally, but I apologize. I still have a couple more slides. Enhanced outcomes and target tracking. So as I remembered, there's proof of employment that is required at these milestones for these performance-based funding markers. To ensure that the client is working as claimed, there is proof requested. Now, that proof of employment has shifted towards like attestation being very accepted for the most part. However, the initial ask is for pay stubs to be submitted And those are required to meet the milestone indicators. Now, if we're thinking about pay stubs, just really briefly, we might put ourselves in the seats of Stream A clients who only needed a little bit of help with a resume, or maybe, you know, some tailoring for a specific industry or job search help or whatever it was. And you have to maintain a relationship with that individual at these monthly indicators for up to a year. Naturally, there's some pushback from those clients who don't understand why you let me use a computer and now you're calling me all the time and you're asking for my pay stubs. So there is an issue with that when it comes to Stream A clients. But regardless, there is administrative work, quote unquote, that needs to be done to ensure that these items are taken care of so that performance-based funding can be received. That does mean, in addition to all the tracking that already takes place, that there is the employment proof kind of tracking. Also within this, for the flow through dollars, that funding, sorry, I don't have my notes on this, I'm pulling it from memory, but for the flow through dollars, I'm fairly certain that the ministry is who oversees the approvals of those dollars. And so you're still going through the same like administrative steps to get that remittance. Drat, I shouldn't have brought that up. I will follow up in an email. My apologies. So for clients, we have that proof of employment, that 20-hour-a-week minimum. For frontline staff, we have enhanced training required for the common assessment tool, effective delivery. But also because of the enhanced tracking practices, we are encouraging organizations to have a look at their current data management practices and building up the capacity of their staff where it makes sense to, so that they have the savvy to be fairly thorough data trackers themselves. That said, it's like one of the only recommendations that we're making about staff for the most part. We'll recommend trainings. You'll see that through the slides here, and I'll have a handout over to Serna to include as well. But because we don't know who the SSM is, and there is time to get there still, we're not recommending any over large sweeping organizational changes or anything like that in advance of transformation. There's trainings that we're recommending, and the data savvy, I'm going to call it, is one of those elements that we would encourage folks to identify within their staff. But otherwise, no other large changes, because we don't know if there's going to be a new data management system introduced. We don't know if they are going to designate a priority population funding, like pool of funding. There are so many items that we don't know. So changes at a minimal. In addition, though, building that organizational resilience is just exceptionally important. There's a lot of change that is happening within the system. There are varying amounts of change that will impact you as practitioners and your other frontline staff, as well as for leadership. But building up that resilience, that trust, those kind of sound practices within your purview are what we would focus on. How should I say that? So keep doing what you're doing, like keep doing your excellent work, and keep your focus there on that excellence that you put forward, while building up that organizational resilience. And you can weather the storm that is to come. And I have to say, and I think I'm allowed to say this because we are a province-wide network, that our phase 3 catchments, or you guys being in Toronto, are at a bit of a benefit, being the last to go through it, only to say that we can see all the mistakes that have been made, and we can see how they're being lessened with each phase of the transition, and the willingness of the government to make some changes is quite positive. I think I have one more. Systemic considerations. I'm just going to touch on some of these very briefly, because I'm aware of the time, and I think I want to dig in or allow you guys to talk a bit more about perhaps the timeline or what the process is for Toronto as a catchment. A couple of things. This isn't the first transformation Ontario has undergone. It's my first in the sector, but I think there have been 2 or 3 since the 80s, or this, right? Something like that. Stay tuned. We're hoping to deliver a report on that history sometime soon. But this isn't the only transformation the province has gone through. It is the largest. There is a pandemic happening in the background. There's also a lack of evaluation based on the government's own communications, just for the fact that there won't be enough time in the system to have evaluation before April of this year. And so in terms of in terms of bringing in flexibility into the framework that's being released, remains to be seen. I think the last thing that I want to mention here is that this transformation, spurred by the Auditor General's reports, focusing on the inability for Ontario Works to bring clients through to successful employment, is what's driving this transformation. And at the same time, there's a social assistance transformation happening in the background that we know even less about. And it means that First Work, at least, understands we may have to go to the federal government and rely on them more as a partner, particularly in the youth employment space. We're starting to see attention paid by the Minister McNaughton's office to the youth-specific file, but we've made the mistake of cutting youth-specific funding before. And this mistake is being repeated currently. And it's with that in mind that we know that we have work to do on the advocacy side, but we also have to be realistic in terms of how that is going to be heard. And so that's why we as an organization are going to be focused a little bit more federally, in addition to the ongoing advocacy that we do provincially, but just on this youth-specific file, just by nature of fit. I'm rattling through all the questions that I was asked in advance. Just
That's
trying
okay.
to see if I
I can,
address
do
them
you
all.
want me to pull up the screen? The
Yeah, that would be
Yeah.
great. That would be great.
Let's do that. I'll share my screen. And we'll look at the questions. So here they are. And then also I'll pull up the questions from the chat. So
Okay.
apologies, let me just get to the questions slide. All right. So these are the questions that came in registration, but I'm going to keep them up here so we can make sure they're answered by the end of today. But I think just pulling from the chat, there was a lot of questions around the common assessment tool. So it's wonderful that you have it and that we can look at it and try to understand it. One of the questions, very kind of like foundational question, was how was it developed? How was common assessment tool developed? Who developed it? Do we know that?
So it's not a secret. It's not a secret. Do I have that information is a better question. So in terms of the development, if there's anyone on this call that actually has this off the top of their heads, welcome it. But my understanding is that the ministry got together a group of stakeholders from the sector. So actually employment service providers, some practitioners are on that advisory committee that helped develop, I think, the framework of the questions. Do I think that those ESPs were involved in, oops, somebody's not on mute?
Yeah, you can mute yourself in case you're not. I'm searching
got
for
it.
the person who's not muted,
Got it.
but okay,
Sorry. Apologies, I just lost my train of
yeah,
thought.
I think so. What you're saying is that a group of stakeholders that were involved in sort of like developing this new service delivery model, that recommendation came actually from the sector for common assessment tool. And that makes sense to me because a lot of my colleagues in the sector have attended the career and work practitioner program at George Brown. And there is a common assessment training is very common, is one of the kind of core courses and core skills that they develop through that program. So I think, I'm not sure if in this iteration of 150 questions is what it has always been, but it is a known tool in the sector. So I hope that that answers the question. So there's a few other questions around the common assessment tool, like how long does it take to complete it? So that's one question. But let me ask a couple of other questions, because you brought up this concern around the fact that it's very thorough. Some of the questions are very intrusive at the very beginning of a relationship with a client. And my question is whether any of the agencies that have gone through this transformation have taken on the practice of not completing a common assessment until they've really gotten to know the client better so they can properly stream them. Now, I know that would create a bit of a bottleneck. So having clients that you're actually working with, but you can't count for that particular month or whatever, you know, you have to sort of like delay the data entry.
So it's a great question. It's a great question. And I can say that there were definitely agencies that thought they would take that approach. And to my understanding, that did not happen on the ground. And again, I think it speaks to needing to enter the outcome into the system. And I didn't dig into this too much, but we know that there's competition in the space. And certainly that's not lost on the service system managers, but some of them are trying to capitalize on that competition to say, okay, well, let's see who does best. So let's have a leaderboard and let's, you know, see who's doing best at this agency today. There are varying degrees of that within. And so that could play a role in not actually taking the time to build those relationships. Certainly this is certainly that's more agency specific, and that will have to be determined individually.
Thank you. That's something I completely forgot, but you're right. Best laid plans, and then we have the reality of which
Okay.
brings other complexities along with it. Sanjay,
Hmm.
thank you for answering the question in the chat, how long it takes to complete it. So I guess you have been doing the common assessment. He says 35 to 45 minutes to complete the common assessment tool.
Yes,
If you'd like to share more, feel free.
it's 35 to 45 minutes. It depends upon average what your client is.
Okay.
For example, if the client answer one question, yes, there are like 4 or 5 questions open underneath, and which are like, and they are asking like same question 3 or 4 times. If the client says has a disability and tells you multiple problems, then it's around about 45, 50 minutes even, and that's only common assessment. You're not going to the ESP, you're not doing anything. That's about that one. And if the client is easy, no, like a client, you can do it around about in 30 minutes because you have to ask all the questions.
I see. You have to. So it pops up. It's on your computer, right? And you're going through it, and you have to enter an answer. You can't skip questions, is what you're saying.
No, you cannot skip question. You won't go to the next page,
Okay.
and you will go to the final page once you have everything, and then you will submit.
Got it. Sanjay, thank you. Are you able to tell us where you work, like which EO you're part of?
Humber.
Oh, at Humber College. Okay, so
Yeah.
you are at Humber that's already doing the new
Yeah, the
service delivery.
Brampton location. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's right. Okay.
Sanjay, thank you so much. That's super helpful information for the rest of the group. And sounds like you've gotten some great practice in it, that you know, like depending on which kind of client, how long it's going to take. The one thing that I'll add to what Sanjay offered is that the ministry has indicated in many of their presentations that they encourage the CAT to be completed within 1 or 2 sessions, so that there is that time for relationship building. But I think Sanjay is right that if you're sitting down to do it so that you can get that client into service, that upwards to an hour if that client has defined barriers via disabilities, as the CAT indicates. It'll take a little bit more time.
Thank you. And I want to ask you a couple of other questions from the chat that are not up on the screen. So you've mentioned about the YJC, that we're losing that specific pot of money for youth funding. What about summer jobs as well? That's included in.
Yeah, so Youth Job Connection and Youth Job Connection Summer are both they've been eliminated as programs in the new model. So just to be very specific, when the transition happens to the new model, funding is like status quo for the most part. And so it's with that YJC comes back and then dies. So like it's around in Toronto right now, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It still exists, but no longer in the new transformed model.
Got it.
And that includes Canada Summer Jobs with the feds. So
yeah, that's huge.
Please.
Okay. Oh, and then there's another question. Could you mention that in the introduction of these new milestones to reach, right, of tracking at 1, 3, 6, 9, and 12, the caseloads are growing because clients are not easily exited. So once a client becomes a client, in order to really be exited, we need at least a year. So one of the question is, what is the ratio of staff to clients? Or let me see the exact question.
I saw that and I started sweating behind my knees. So I apologize. I cannot answer that question for you in terms of a ratio. However, that's a really great question to ask my research team. So can you stay tuned for our report that's coming out, and I will hopefully follow up with Serna and tell you what page to look at and everything. If we are able to develop that. No one can answer.
Yeah,
Sounds about
I
right.
guess it's also going to be agency specific, and
Very
I
much
spoke
so.
with an EO program manager in Halton region. And what she told me, for them, their client caseloads are at around 50 per staff right now. And she says those are low compared to what they were in the past. And one of the challenges they've had is what you talked about, Sophia, is this transfer of clients from OW to ES, right? So the clients, I guess this is also a question for you, Sophia. Can a client walk in into an employment service provider, just like they have been doing so far? Or, and then in addition to that, right, some clients are transferred internally from OW to ES. Okay. Yeah.
So
yeah.
yeah, so you've hit the nail on the head in terms of that referral process being a bit sticky, for lack of a better word. What I will say is, we have seen an improvement in the referral process that I think speaks to better top-down communications with our OW, ODSP employment partners kind of thing.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Let's maybe pick one of the questions from this slide. Okay, yeah, there's another question from Simon in the chat as well, right? So questions around where can we provide feedback? So what are the channels? I guess for service providers, for even, what about clients? I know we have a few people on the call today that are actually service users of Employment Ontario.
Really?
So where can different parties provide feedback to who? To the SSM, to the ministry? Are there any channels?
Great question. Thank you, Simon, for that question. Unfortunately, there is no input pathway for feedback for the transformation process. First Work has requested and advocated that service providers be afforded the opportunity to have a direct feedback pathway, so that we can ensure that the best practices are coming through with this transformation. Unfortunately, that hasn't come through. I can tell you that we, as Ontario's employment network, whether you're a First Work member or not, have taken up this charge to be that pathway in lieu of not having one. So certainly my contact information is on the slide deck. Sorry, I guess I didn't get to that slide, but you can reach out to us and we can be that vehicle for you. In regards to the new SSM specifically, unfortunately, I would anticipate that the feedback that the ministry would be willing to receive is done through those market sounding sessions. So to that extent, I think that feedback period might be closed. However, for ongoing improvement for the transformation, certainly we can be that vehicle for you. And if we find another avenue, we will certainly share it.
Oops, apologies. Okay, that's great. So I know a lot of people are wanting to access the common assessment tool. You also mentioned that there is a handout of recommendations for staff training. So I'll be following up with you to make sure we have all of this. I strongly encourage everybody to, even if you have time right now or after the session, I've put in the evaluation survey in the chat. You can take a few minutes to tell us what questions you still have about the EO transformation, and give us a little bit of feedback on this session. That would be great. But people have registered, so I will be following up via an email to everybody who registered and attended with those additional resources.
Mhm.
I think we had a couple of other questions in
Yeah.
chat.
So I'm looking at Jennifer's question in regards to quality versus quantity and sustainability, particularly in regards to the high number of mental health concerns that we are witnessing coming out of this pandemic. Jennifer, I can tell you that our research team, similar to the approach that we took in our report delivered last year, where we did a cross-jurisdictional scan of the systems that informed this new model. So there was a system in the UK, Australia, and then actually in British Columbia that this model was designed after. And so we took an in-depth review of the best practices that came out of those models and put forward some recommendations aligning. In regards to this year's report sneak peek, we are focused in on performance-based funding in comparison to an outcomes-based case management approach, which is championed by our friends at CCDF, so the Canadian Career Professionals folks. I'm getting the acronym wrong. And out in Saskatchewan. And they have a the employability matrix, or like that you move on this. I'm getting this so wrong, I apologize. But that folks are on a scale of employability, and they make incremental steps towards the final outcome, which is, employed. But that there is a count for the steps that are taken. And we know that with youth specifically, and with folks who have been unemployed for a very long time or transitioning to a whole new country, requires some additional time, additional interventions to move them closer to employment, and for those steps to be seen as the milestones that they are.
Okay, so that would support the quality and the holistic versus quantity, like the quality of service and the holistic approach to service delivery, rather than looking at one kind of size fits all outcome or performance.
So those conversations are taking place, Jennifer, to the effect that we'll see them translate into the new model. I'm unsure.
It's really a turbulent time. It's a time of opportunity. It's a time of a lot of change. It's also, I love Simon's question because it should also be an opportunity to influence the change that is underfoot, and it's really tremendous change. Although for many of us in the sector, and like you mentioned, Sophia, this is iteration number 2 or 3 at least of EO specifically transformation and changing. So I think because of all the repetition, we're not maybe realizing the extent that it is a huge, massive change, because I think if we look at the bigger picture with OW, so the municipal, and I guess the Ontario Works, right? How Ontario Works is administered and delivered, as well as ODSP, and all of those clients now being really channeled into EO, right? Whereas prior to, I think most clients kind of walk through the door and look for services, but now it's really working towards this integrated service delivery model. The manager of EO that I spoke to in Halton said that's been a challenge, that it's not integrated nowhere near at this point, and that has been a challenge. We know that those two systems have worked very independently of each other, have had different oversights. And we also know, and sorry if I'm sort of rambling on this a little bit, I think it's really relevant that the profile of a client on EO has changed significantly. And Jennifer brought up mental health issues. There are huge mental health issues for clients who are on EO compared to, if we look 10 years back to now, the client profile is further from the labor market with more barriers. And also that speaks to the tightness of the labor market right now. I spoke with a manager of one of the service managers at OW, and she said whoever could work is working because the labor market's tight. There are jobs, right? It's sort of a job seekers labor market. Roughly speaking, there's lots of nuance in that, but at the moment, and so the clients that are on OW do have complex barriers to employment, and so that's a different client profile. And I think for a lot of the organizations that we work with at Toronto North LIP and other local immigration partnerships in Toronto, we serve the newcomer clients, right? And then there are different types of newcomer clients. If we want to profile the newcomer client, there's many different profiles, but I think one of the concerns has been that under the new EO model, most of the clients, newcomer clients, will come out on the other side of that common assessment as a Stream A client because of their relatively high level of education, because of their high level of language skill and great employment history that they bring to the country just by virtue of having gone through the immigration system and being given that permanent resident status. So go ahead.
Sorry, if I could just jump in really quickly. We did see that as an issue with the Common Assessment tool spitting out Ukrainian refugees as Stream A clients. Again, what we've heard, some changes have taken place to ensure that they are not being serviced in Stream A service levels. But yes, a whole host of complexities that are kind of taking place within this transformation. And Serna, I really appreciate you kind of wrapping it all up for us, because this is a lot of changes. And I do think that I've kind of skimmed the surface a little bit. And so if there's a desire for a part 2 deeper dive kind of thing, like I want to hear about this X, Y, and Z, happy to help pull that together if we want to hear from more practitioners and the like. But you're absolutely right. Like, we're in a tight labor market with a looming recession, maybe. And the one good thing that I could say is that it does seem that employers are starting to understand that this is the reality that we're working with. I'm not sure how, anyway, it is going to be a challenge. The tight labor market helps our narrative from an advocacy standpoint, just to kind of drill down, like, those who need supports really need them, because there are complexities here. So, but that to say that there is some willingness for improvement as the system evolves. We as First Work are happy to be your advocates in this transformation. We are happy to take feedback where you wish to give it. So definitely appreciate that. Yeah, certainly there are steps to be seen in regards to Toronto specifically, but there will be a whole host of attention on Toronto when this finally comes to transition time. So we will be raising the profile of this transformation and doing our best to raise the public interest into what's going on here as well.
Thank you, Sophia, so much. It is such a complex topic. So I think it was I hope that it was really helpful for everyone to just sort of step back. And this is what we're trying to provide through these sessions, an opportunity to step back, look at the bigger pictures, understand a little bit the complexities, and be able to plan for the changes that are already here and still coming down the pipeline. So, you know, I would love to see by a show of hand, if you want to just raise your little icon hand up, how many people would be interested in another session? And some of the topics that Sophia and I have discussed, okay, I'm seeing some hands up already, are around really understanding also what's going on the OW side of this transformation, right? Because we're going to be required to work more closely with Ontario Works counterparts, as well as, you know, hearing from service managers, sorry, not the SSMs, but rather the EO program managers that are already going through this transformation. So maybe hearing from them about, like, you know, that are not too far. We've heard folks from Brampton who are who already have some learnings to share, right? Halton, those are all part of the GTA region, really. So we could bring a few folks in where we can ask more kind of operational day-to-day nitty-gritty questions to help with the planning of the transition. So I'm hearing enough hands up. I'm seeing enough hands up that I'm seeing that there's some interest in this. So that's another. So stay tuned. Stay tuned for the part 2, 3, and maybe 4. And before we say bye for today, if you wouldn't mind clicking on the link in the chat, I put it in again right at 3:30 for the evaluation, and I'd love to read through your responses, and that will also inform the planning of the upcoming sessions. But for now, we're past 3:30, so I'm going to wish everybody a great rest of the day. And thank you, Sophia, so much for bringing this to us. And you'll be getting materials from Sophia through me, as well as Sophia, I'll definitely be following up with you on the your next report that's coming up. That didn't escape me.
Yes. And feel free to reach out. Cernal will have my contact information in those materials. So thank you for the space. Yeah, hope to be chatting with more of you in the future. Thanks again,
Thanks,
Cernal.
everybody. Thank you, Sophia.
Bye.
Bye for now. We'll see you again soon.